Hello, good morning, and welcome back. It's Mr. Snow. I'm finally back here again. I know it's been a little bit, but we had a spring break actually. So I'm going to finish up a project here, or at least begin to finish it up, if that even makes sense. I'm going to split the JavaScript for our Pomodoro clock into two videos. I'm just going to start with some functionality of some buttons and how we get to interact with buttons on our page itself. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and separate out the logic in the next video and wrap it all up. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to show you two things that we're going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here so you can see what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm going to take a look at here is this parse int. So parse int function parses a string argument and returns an integer of the specified radix, which is the base in mathematical numerical systems. So essentially we can parse int and we can use that with a string and then use that as an integer. Now, if we don't pass it this second parameter, all right, we're just going to be, if we don't specify anything, we're going to get base 10. All right, for what we're going to parse. What that means is if you wanted to take a long string and figure out what that value would be in your standard base 10, so if you have the number 800, if you go ahead and parse that int, you can specify a radix of 10, which is our base 10, which is our normal counting system, like we do on our hands and our toes, right? Or we can do something like even like base 2, and we can get a number in binary if we wanted. It's pretty cool. So we're going to be using parse int. We've used this before in our other challenges, but I figured I'd just show you where this is here, over here in this MDN page. And the next thing we're going to be using is we're just going to be using jQuery. Here, this is the jQuery documentation where we're going to use this .html, okay? And .html, then we can insert an HTML string, and as you can see, it's going to overwrite the HTML using that, all right? So you're setting the content that we're identifying, all right? Or essentially getting rid of whatever's there and overwriting it. So that's what we're going to need to start off with here. And then what we're going to do is we're also going to initialize our buzzer sounds. So here's our clock here, and this is what we have. We've got some simple CSS. We've got a background, a little div here, some text, some clicky buttons, all right, that don't do anything, and that's about it. So now let's be able to interact with this. And again, we're using the Cloud9 IDE, or at least that's what I'm using. You could be using your Atom editor, or even you could be using the CodePen actually, and just be less complex than this. If you're using your CodePen, you're just going to go right over to your JavaScript window. If you've gone ahead and set this up with me using an IDE, you already have it in your JS folder, right, wherever you called your JavaScript folder. You should have an index.js or whatever your main JavaScript you're going to be using. Remember that JavaScript must be linked here at the top in your HTML. All right. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's probably because you're just using the CodePen and you could ignore what I just said. Anyway, you're in your index.js here. And we're going to be using jQuery. So again, I'm just going to start everything off with my function. All right. And then look, it automatically starts giving me my function for my jQuery selector, which is pretty nice. So I want a function here, and that function is going to be my entire, well, my everything essentially, right? So we can just do this to kick this off, start off with. Yeah, there you go. Make this a little neater. The first thing that we're going to want to do, let's take a look at our index.html. This line right here, we have a script type, all right? And then we have, this is our index.js. We're going to be linking to this script. And then under here, we have our audio. Now, this audio has a source, and I showed you where the source is for this. And we took a look inside of that. We inspected that element. We noticed that this was inside of an array, and we want the MP3 to sound, and that is going to be the first position of the array at this location here, okay? Remember, so if you go to this web address here, you're going to be getting an array. So we can't just call to this source. We actually have to call to the first position of this source, which it's a 0 base index. So it's going to be that brackets with a 0, right? It's a 0-based index. So what would that look like in our JavaScript? Well, we know we just want to set this ID of buzzer, and I want to just be able to use this easily. So I need to set this to a variable to use this a little bit later on, or actually in our next video. So it makes sense just to call this variable here, we'll just call it buzzer, because it's going to be a buzzer. Okay, so I have a var now for buzzer. And what is that going to equal? Well, that's just going to equal, all right? I want to have jQuery go ahead and find the ID buzzer in my HTML, all right? But unfortunately, that is not quite enough, because this buzzer here, that's only going to take us to an array. So I need to make sure I have 0, all right? So our array of 0. Okay. The next variable that I'm going to want is I'm going to need 2 counters. Okay. So I'm going to call this count. And notice I just put a comma here instead of a semicolon, so I don't have to write var again. So I'm going to have another one. I'm going to have a count. There's going to be a comma, and then I'm going to have a count 2. All right. And so what is this count going to equal? All right. Well, let's take a look at our index. The count, I want to parse the integers for this session time and the break time. So first I have is this session time, and then I have this break time. And I call these num and break num. Okay, so I want to parse those integers, whatever integer is currently in that field. I want to set that to a variable. That way later on, I could do something else with that as well. All right. So we'll get into what I'm going to do with that. But for right now, just know that we need to store that number, all right, which is just sitting there. All right, I want to store that in an actual variable. So I can go ahead and parse int. There you go. Shows right up. And what do I want to parse in that int? Well, I want to make sure that I parse int. I want to grab the jQuery here. Okay, so make sure we grab jQuery selectors. Then here, I want to grab the ID of num. Okay. There we go. And once I grab that, I want to make sure that I grab that. Let me go up here. So if I don't put a string, and if I just want to grab the content, okay, I could just use this .html. All right. So you can see get the HTML contents of the first element in a set of matched elements. So I have a set of matched elements here that jQuery is going to find, all right, which is this jQuery find this num. So all I have to say is .html. Okay, and it's .html with an closing bracket, right? Right. Oops, I put that in the wrong spot. Of course I put that in the wrong spot. See what happens when I switch back and forth? .html. Bam. Good. So you can see I have this parse int, and there's the opening, and there's the closing bracket. All right, so I'm going to parse this entire int. But what am I going to parse? I'm going to have jQuery go ahead and find this num ID, and I want the contents of that HTML. Right? So I'm using parse int here, and I'm using this .html. Okay. I can also use this .html to overwrite as well, but I don't want to do that. And since I don't want to mess up syntax again, I'm going to cheat here by just copying this, pasting that, and I want not count, but remember count 2, and I don't want num, I want break num. Okay. So I'm going to parse the int here from again the jQuery selector break num and num. So break num, and remember there's going to be a number here and a number here, and I'm just setting that number. So all of that just says find whatever this number, this HTML element is, which I'm telling you is going to be a number. all right, and parse that using a radix of 10 or the base 10 number system and assign that to the variables count and count2. Okay, and actually, you know what? That's going to be the only variables I want for right now. And here you go, define variables. That's never being used. Yes, I know. Not a big deal. All right, so let's go ahead and once we have this setup done, so now I have variables that are identified as those individual HTML elements that are in between my buttons, right? So now I have this right here. I'm parsing this int, and I'm parsing this int that's in between these plus and minus buttons. All right. So then what I want to do now is I want to target this button and to change this, and I want to target this button to change this, right? So if I go minus, all right, I want this to go minus. If I click this plus, I want this to add 5, all right? And if I click this, I want it to minus 5, unless, of course, it is 0. So how do we do this? Well, we know that we have this here. Let's see what this button was called. If you don't remember, because it's been a little while. Button. So I have M5 time, and then 5, and then A5 time, right? So minus 5 time, add 5 time, and then M5 break, add 5 break. All right, I can do that. I can do that. Notice I'm not consistent with my camel case here. That's not very good. It should really be a capital T. That's okay. But we'll just make sure we are all consistent. So let's start off with grabbing this first button here. And that first button, jQuery, quotes, ID, M5 time. Okay, so I'm going to grab that M5 time. And then I'm also going to use this dot click that we've used before. All right, so when we click on it, when we click on this, I actually want to run a function. All right, so notice it has an event handler there. So I'm actually going to run an anonymous function. All right, and that function is going to run is going to look like, let's see here. My computer almost tried to restart on me. Don't you restart. All right, make sure actually I finish this off. The function that I'm going to run here is going to say something like, as long as this number is greater than 0, right? We're going to have a session time. I want to be able to click this and subtract 5 from this until it's 0, because you can't have a negative 5 time. Well, you can, but for this project, we're not going to have a negative 5 time. So all I have to do is say that if that number here, if this HTML element, which is a number, is greater than 0, go ahead and add 5. Okay, so I can handle that, right? We can handle that. So how do we do that? Well, so let's just say an if statement, right? So if we call this first one count, right? That's our first variable. So as long as count is greater than 0, right? So, and count, remember, refers back to that HTML element with that ID num and the actual content of that. So as long as that's greater than 0, all I want to do right, is take the count and minus equal 5. So every time I click on it, it's going to decrement 5. Okay. And then after I decrement that count by 5, okay, that's the variable count. All right. So I'm just changing the variable. So set the variable to what the HTML is. But if I click on it, I want to subtract 5 from that. And then I will have to overwrite that HTML element, all right, to that new count value. So I took the HTML, set the HTML to count, okay? So I set HTML to count. But if I click this button, I'm going to change count and then re-overwrite, okay? So overwrite that again with the HTML element with the new value of count. So I can just use jQuery to do that in the .html. So how do I do this? Again, I'm going to use jQuery to grab this. And jQuery is going to grab, what is it going to grab? All right. It's going to grab, all right, so first we looked at grab the button, right, which was M5 time, but I don't want that M5 time. I want to overwrite this ID here, this H2 element num that has a value of 5, okay? So if I grab this here, this HTML, all right, I'm going to overwrite the HTML, the content of that HTML to that new variable. So again, that's going to be num. Okay, that's going to be num is what we called that ID. There's our num. And that num, I'm going to .html, okay, which is that same method I showed you. And I'm just going to overwrite that to the newly decremented by 5 variable count. And outside of this, I am just going to use event dot event is that right? Event.prevent defaults. All right. And what that does is every time you click on a button, if you notice before, it's going to try to reset the page so that jumps to the top. I don't want my page to jump around just in case it doesn't fill the screen. So prevent default means prevent it from jumping back up to the top of the page. So you can just click on it and it's not going to look like it almost reloads. All right. So let's see here. It doesn't like jQuery right now. So let's control save this. And let's reload. And let's see if our buttons here are working. So counts. We have our M5 time. All right, which is this. And that's our negative. There we go. And we should actually get 0 since if its count is greater than 0. Let's take a look at what we have here. So we should actually be overwriting that now. So we have M5 time. I'm actually just checking my syntax here to make sure my functions are all correct because we're not doing much. That should be decrementing that by 5. Let's take a look at this. Save. Reload. Sometimes with this all right, so it's not updating. All right, that's all that's going on here. And you can see that even that event.prevent default's not working, so it's just not updating. All right, so let's go ahead and continue with this, and then we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So I have my var buzzer, I have my jQuery running, I have my jQuery set in my HTML. I'm running jQuery before my JS file, which should be good. All right, I'm going to find that jQuery to do. All right, so let's go ahead and keep working on this. The next thing I want to do is click on this next button here. And this next button is going to give us the same thing, except I want to increment that count number. All right, and I don't really need an if statement there because as long as I have a 5, I should be good to go. And I know my default is going to be 5. So since I'm going to have something very similar to this, I can simply Control-C, Control-V. And instead of M5 time, I have A5 time. Instead of count, is still count, but I actually don't need this as long as count is greater than 0, right? Because if it's 0, it doesn't really matter. I don't need this if statement. This one's a little simpler. All I have to do is, instead of decrementing it, I have to increment it. And then I have this this right here. There we go. So all I did was simplify this. I'll delete some space. And let's just see here. We can go ahead and where is our, I forget where it's at now. I was going to fix this. You can actually fix everything with this as well. And it is in, where is it? There we go. Apply code formatting. Makes it look pretty. Oh, all right, so let's run that. Reload you. Is my JavaScript running? Run index.js. All right, we'll take a look at this in a little bit. I'm missing something again. Figures I'm missing something. I actually have my second machine, my test machine, to make sure that I, as I'm going ahead and doing this, that it's working just fine. But this is right. I'm missing something when I'm starting off my my program here, my virtual machine. I'll figure it out in a minute, but I don't want to take up your time. The whole point is to make this quick. So I have a plus and a minus here. And then once I have this set, HTML, that's it. I have another typo. I'll find it. If you guys see it, it's always funny when I watch my videos back and I'm like, oh, what are you doing? It's right there. It's right there. But when I'm doing it live, because I do this all in one take, guys, that's how come sometimes I run into this. And it just shows you, if you get stuck, don't get too frustrated. All right, so there's my plus and minus buttons for the clock. I need a plus and minus buttons here again. And so instead of add 5 break, I have M5 break, A5 break, and count 2, and break num. So M5 break, count 2, count 2. Break num, count 2. And you can see how I'm just modifying the code. It's kind of easier to do this. So A5 break, count 2. Break num, and count 2. Okay. And there we have it. And so right now we have our buttons. So after we have our buttons, control save. And so now we have a buzzer. We have our that we can access later, and we can go ahead and play that. All right. We also have our buttons, our minus and our plus buttons. So again, as long as that count is greater than 0, because we won't want negative, we're going to decrement 5. And again, I just have this event up prevent default, so it stops jumping around. And then the same thing, if we add 5, we're just going to keep adding 5 to count and overwriting our HTML. All right. And again, like I said, I was going to try to make this quicker. So there's just our buttons. And in our next video, we're going to go through and do our logic for our timer itself. Okay. And that's going to be a little bit more tricky. And so we're going to have to sit down and do things like setting up intervals and timers, and we'll get into that next time. So again, hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you all next time.